Hi, this is Dr. Burton, and we're back talking about critical theory. And today I want to talk about what is critical theory. Let's discuss that. What is it? Some people see it as an ideology, and an ideology is like a political movement. So, is critical theory a political movement? It looks like it's connected to politics. It has political implications. But I'm going to say maybe it's not just ideology. Let's put that in a category. Maybe we should look up ideology and get a definition of what an ideology is. Let's do it. Ideology. Ideology, a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy. The science of ideas and the study of their origin and nature. So, yeah, maybe critical theory has to do with economic and political theory, but I'm going to say it's broader than that. Some see similarities to religion. I've seen people online talking about critical theory as a new religion. Maybe it's an atheistic religion. Yeah, I'm not sure. Let's think about what religion is. Maybe it has aspects of a religion. I define religion as a belief or set of beliefs that we use to give meaning to experience. So a belief or set of beliefs, and we use it to give meaning to our experience. So in a sense, critical theory does give meaning to experience, but I think it is more of a philosophy than a religion. So let's think about that. I'm going to suggest that critical theory is a philosophical system. It's a system of truth. And now I say truth with my eyes rolling, a claim to truth. There are many philosophical systems, and we could look at them and critically analyze them. So critical theory has a history. It is a belief that has developed over time. It has a history in the West, Western philosophy. And when I named Immanuel Kant, and there's probably people before Kant we could trace it to, it has a pedigree in philosophy that goes back to the modern period. And I suggested that the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche are more foundational for critical theory. And I will also mention that he is the father of existential philosophy, and he's probably the grandfather of postmodern philosophy. So there are similarities to existentialism and postmodernism in critical theory, but I'm going to suggest it's more. It's more than that. So critical theory has a history. Critical theory dominates the academy, and especially the last 10 or 20 years. I have been in the academy, the secular academy, for almost 30 years. I know I'm not that old, but really, almost 30 years. And I saw signs of this coming maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago. But really in 2015 with the Black Lives Matter movement, when it just comes on the scene, that's when critical theory to me became something I should pay attention to and study. So it dominates in the academy now. How did that happen? Did you know that analytic philosophy used to dominate the academy in America up until about 10 years ago? And I went to Arizona State University and I saw it happen. I was in the master's degree program at Arizona State University. It was hardcore analytic, which is married to science. It's like philosophy is the handmaiden to science. And then my friends went on to do the PhD at ASU. Some of you are my friends who did that program. I didn't get in. I had an alternative pathway. But they shut down the PhD program for a while. And it was because I guess maybe people weren't going to get a job in analytic philosophy. It was losing popularity. And then they started it up again with a more practical and ethical focus. And if you look at the courses that are offered now, they are more leaning more towards critical theory. And if you go to Arizona State University West, the flavor of philosophy on that campus is definitely continental philosophy and critical theory. So I mentioned analytic philosophy. It was the dominant way of doing philosophy in the academy, I'm going to say, into the last 10 years. Another system that started off very popular and lost popularity in the 1950s was pragmatism, but it makes a comeback with Richard Rorty probably in the 1990s and early 2000s. But pragmatism doesn't have a activist component, really. Maybe it's just getting stuff done without the historical critique. So Nietzsche's views of what to do in this world tend to be sort of pragmatic. Let's do what works, and it's usually what works to get us pleasure. Pragmatism is very popular now, but pragmatism with critical theory becomes even more powerful. So Richard Rorty, in his writings, I don't have any at my hand to show you, but he tends to critique the analytic school of philosophy and shows that these three strains, analytic and continental and pragmatist, are all really pragmatists. Now, in a sense, he's right in that philosophy becomes doing what works, but the critical theorists have another piece that the pragmatists don't, and that is the critique piece. Critical theory is critique, and it's critique of the old values. And so there's going to be the critical part that is a historical situating of ideas that analytic and pragmatic philosophers have failed to do. And I'm going to suggest that is why critical theory becomes the dominant philosophy in the academy now. And it's not just in philosophy departments. The philosophy departments may have been the last ones to adopt critical theory as their method or as their system. It first begins in the social sciences, and then in the humanities departments. The humanities were already doing some postmodern things. Derrida and Foucault, postmodern philosophers, I'll call them post-Nietzschean philosophers, are also doing some of the work of the critique, the critical part. So critical theory picks up in the humanities, and then it goes into the philosophy departments. And now in the sciences, there's a critique of science and math. They claim objectivity, and for critical theory, there is no objectivity. There is no privileged position of truth. So that's just to talk about how critical theory is a philosophical system that has a history, and it's a history that has developed such that it now dominates in the academy. It is a system that is expected to be viewed as true. So it's a system of truth. And it's almost taken as obvious truth. And if you don't accept this truth, then there's something mistaken. There's an error. You're holding on to tradition, or you have false consciousness. So there are ways for critical theorists to talk about the non-acceptance of this system as truth. All right, so it's a system that is expected to be viewed as true. So it's a world and life view. Critical theory as a philosophy that looks maybe like religion is a world and life view. And this goes back to what I talk about as the constructive use of reason. Reason is used to construct a coherent world and life view. And as a construct, it doesn't necessarily have to be actually true, fitting reality, but it is coherent. So let's think about the world and life view of critical theory. And is it coherent? Coherent means all the parts fit together. Now, I want to just do a little side discussion for a second, because when I look at the worldview of critical theory, to me it's a little bit surprising. It shouldn't be, but it is. And it's surprising because for the past, 25 years, I have been studying materialism, naturalism, material monism. Material monism is the position that says all that exists is matter and matter is eternal. And I once believed that was true, that all that exists is matter. There is no soul. There is no God. There's no afterlife. This is the only life that we have. And when you're dead, you're dead. The origin of the cosmos is from the Big Bang. The origin of life is from this evolution. The destiny of humans is when you're dead, that's it. There's no other life beyond this. Human equality, well, there really isn't any, because survival of the fittest. It's a dog-eat-dog world. Thinking is motion of atoms in the brain. It's a physical process. The good life is probably pleasure, the satisfaction of your desires. And there's rationality it's just what we say it is. It's an evolutionary process. It's part of having a brain. There's no objective truth outside of us. There's not like some, standard of truth or morality and goodness. Political authority is based on power struggles. And other religions, I would think they were just mistaken. Maybe they believe what they believe because of an evolutionary process. Maybe religion is like a evolutionary holdover. These are materialist views. These are the material monist worldview. Those are all the parts of it. If you start with, usually they start with all of our knowledge is through the senses. Empiricism, and then all that exists is the material world. All we could know is the material world, and then you fill out the world and life view. So I have been focused on that worldview and trying to critique it. I wrote my book, Retrieving Knowledge, trying to use Socrates' arguments against empiricism, materialism, skepticism, moral relativism. And I thought, yes, finally we got somewhere. But then as I started to study Nietzsche, who is the anti-Socrates, he's like the opposite of Socrates, I started to see that Nietzsche takes these material monist views to the next level. His epistemology, let's talk about the house. I've spoken about philosophy as a system, as a house. So you have the ground is the epistemology. The epistemology for Nietzsche is empiricism, all of our knowledge is through the senses, but it's a radical empiricism because our senses do not deliver objects of reality. It just delivers to us a stream of sense perceptions that is the flux and flow of matter that is not permanent and fixed. Being is not permanent. There are no forms to being. So the epistemology is reason does not apply to being because there is no being. Reason doesn't grasp what is, like Plato thought. Reason is a tool. It's an instrument, and it's used to organize the flux that we perceive. So reason is not ontological. It does not apply to being. It is a tool, and it's sometimes a tool for domination of others. It's a tool for oppression. We've seen that in critical theory. And our senses don't deliver reality to us. Our senses deliver sense data. All right, that's the ground. There's other things we can say about the epistemology. For example, all that I have is my own perspective. I cannot perceive what you perceive, and we can't maybe even understand each other because of our perceptions being so different. This is maybe where you get the idea of standpoint epistemology in critical theory, that although we have our personal perspectives and minority groups have a particular perspective of the kind of oppression that they've undergone because of their position. And the more intersecting minority experiences we have as a person, the more knowledge we have of that perspective, that unique perspective. So people who have more, let's say I'm a female, I'm African American, and I'm a single mother, those experiences of a minority perspective come together to give a certain knowledge that others without those experiences don't have. That's what intersectionality is about. It comes from perspectivalism, the perspective, and some more things added to it. All right, so the epistemology. All of our knowledge is through the senses. Our senses deliver impressions of the flux. We have to impose order on it. So knowledge is what we put out there. We are constructing reality in our interpretation. We are constructing ourselves. We are not perceiving the world. We are imposing an interpretation on the world. We have our perspective. Our perspectives are different. The metaphysics is still material monism. The foundation of this house is material monism, but it's going to be radical materialism. There's no fixed being. All matter is in motion. There's nothing fixed. This is going to be a problem for science. So what are we studying? This is where we get this idea of language games. So if nothing is fixed, we have perspectives, communal groups of people who have given us a sense of order, maybe like philosophers, maybe like scientists or social scientists, create a language game. And you can think of a game. You've played games before. Think of, video games, Monopoly. That's a game I used to play as a kid. There are rules for the game, right? And there's certain ways to play certain characters. So think of compartments of life like games. Science is a language game, and science used to be the dominant language game. They used to tell us how reality was. But with critical theory, even science is being shown up as a game. This is not reality. This is a social construct, and maybe this is a social construct with some blind spots, and maybe there's systemic racism within science and mathematics too. That's critical theory taking it to the next level. So if all is matter, matter's in motion, we impose our order on the world, then there are actors imposing things, and those people probably have power interests. All right, so that's material monism. What about the rest of the house? The house is where we live our life. The house is the world and life view, all our values and attitudes. Where do those come from? So let's talk about some of them. We can flesh this out more, but the origin of the cosmos. So traditional materialism, let's say modern materialism, said the Big Bang or something like that. With what do we want to call this? Critical theory philosophy. I don't know that we can get away with saying that. That's a theory. That's part of a language game. It's not perhaps something we could know outside of that language game. Nietzsche proposed something called the myth of the eternal return. He said, consider this. If everything is matter, and I guess matter is eternal, that's all there is, then imagine we live this moment as if it were always eternal. And he said if we thought of life like that, not that it's true, but if we thought of life as having this eternal return, then we would be more inclined to live life to the fullest. He's called a vitalist, and vitality of life is what is the goal. So maybe the eternal return is what we talk about in terms of the origin of the cosmos and the flux and how we have this eternal flux. Origin of life on Earth, biological life. I guess we're going to go with the story of evolution, but notice it's a story. And it's also a language game, possibly not a fact, although it does seem like critical theory accepts evolution, and they have this idea of progress. Evolution and progress are ideas borrowed from Charles Darwin and Karl Marx and Friedrich Hegel. So progress and the advance of life. But biological evolution seems to be under critique in one aspect, in that biology doesn't determine ourself, particularly things like gender. Biology doesn't determine who we are. We do. We construct ourselves. We determine who we are with critical theory, or this philosophy undergirding critical theory. Human destiny, what happens when you die? Nothing, you die. But maybe the way we feel a little bit better about it is to tell ourselves a story about the eternal return. I don't know. I don't know if there is any happy ending to this, that, you have about 70 years or 80 years, if you're lucky, and then you die. And I think that's what a lot of the fear of this COVID pandemic is about. A lot of people have this view that when you're dead, that's it. So if this virus is a threat to us, that, I could just get this virus and die, that's pretty scary. So is that driving some of our fear, this fear of death? Origin of thought. What's doing the thinking? Well, I guess it's your brain. Humans are not primarily thinking beings, though, in, let's say, post-Nietzschean / critical theory philosophy. We aren't intellectual beings. We are sensing, willing beings. We are operating out of our desires, our feelings. You've heard it said we're living in an age of feeling right now. I don't know. I think we're thinkers, and that's our problem, is we haven't been thinking. We've accepted this. Are you an animal? I don't think so. I don't talk to animals. I mean, I do. Kino's right here on the floor, always with me, but I don't talk to him like I talk to you. So the origin of thought, it's probably electrical firings in your brain. Human equality. Are humans equal? No. Well, no, but it's not a biological inequality that we're talking about here. It's a sociological inequality. Humans will be equal, I think, in this view. One day, when we realize the final state of society, and this is where critical theory does seem to borrow from Marx, who says we're going through this progression from, feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, and in communism, ownership goes away. Now, critical theory takes that and applies it culturally. So rather than this economic class consciousness, there's also an identity consciousness connected to oppressor and oppress. Classes, categories could be connected to race or gender in addition to class. So humans are not equal, and it's groups that are on. So there's a group oppression and an oppressor status in critical theory. So the goal, though, is liberation from oppression. So the good is connected to that. The good life is achievement of liberation. And this is individually, but also collectively for groups, primarily. There is not an emphasis on the individual with critical theory as there was with modern philosophy, some modern philosophy. So I'm going to say the achievement of liberation is for vitality, and not just vitality of the individual, but for the group, to live to the fullest. So maybe individually, yeah. So let's say my gender preference is such that it gives me vitality and makes me fully alive, rather than, adopting what society tells me. That's good for you, but also there's classes of people who are being oppressed by society, And so the liberation is really for those classes of people. What about rationality? Rationality, I am big on rationality. We're rational beings. Well, they're going to say, no, rationality, the laws of thought, is a fiction. This goes straight to Nietzsche. Reason is a fiction that philosophers invented to impose order on society, but imposing order also imposed restriction on our liberation. It keeps us bound up. It gives us a slave morality, and we need to throw off those chains. This goes right back to Nietzsche. So rationality is not objective. It is not universal. And so that's where we talk about the patriarchy and male oppression, male logic, female emotion. I say we should push back on that for sure. All right, what about freedom? Are humans free? What is freedom? So freedom is not a present reality for some people. Human beings are in chains, and the chains, again, are probably systems of belief that are old. Nietzsche talks about the transvaluation of values. There are these old values that are the slave morality. We need to throw it off and liberate ourselves and liberate groups. And we do this through a power struggle. This is the will to power. This is a driving force in Nietzsche's ethics, the will to power. And he was more of an individualist, but critical theory has taken it in a group sense. I think that's why they use Marx to help with that sort of utilitarian group, greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And the number of people are categorized according to identity, race, class, gender identity. And so political authority is also connected to this will to power. Who gets to rule? Who gets to lead? Leading is according to who has the power. And how do you get the power? You got the power probably illegitimately through force. And maybe it was the force of words. Maybe that's where language harms. Maybe that's what the power of language is here, is we have to get rid of certain words because they're used to dominate people. That's how power is wielded. We tend to think we're civil now. We don't use guns and bombs. We use words, and some words are dangerous and harmful and need to be censored. So a will to power according to identity groups, and not just words, but symbols. Like statues are symbols. Jesus is a symbol. So these symbols represent a different language game. And maybe that language game is viewed as harmful to this language game. So you want to get rid of the old game. Think of it that way. A new game is in town, and it's claiming authority. It's claiming authority, and so it has power. It has the power to destroy and get rid of the old game. What about other worldviews? How does critical theory as a philosophical system view other worldviews, other philosophies, other religions, other ideologies? Perhaps the other views are means of oppressing. Maybe they were language games that need to be exposed for their oppressive values, aspects, especially Christianity. That's the one that seems to be being deconstructed. So you can think of other worldviews as sometimes they call them hegemonic power, the hegemony, the dominant voice, the dominant group, the dominant worldview. Sometimes they're called meta-narratives, and these meta-narratives are stories that we tell ourselves, and it's ways of maintaining power, institutional power. And these other worldviews that use power to oppress, particularly minorities, must be deconstructed and exposed as imperialistic. So these are terms you've heard, right? Think of it this way. Here's how I think of it. Critical theory is a philosophy. Here are some of the things we mentioned. It's a philosophical system. It has a history. It currently dominates in the academy. It is a system that's expected to be viewed as true. And I just went through what this system looks like. It's a world and life view, which involves the constructive use of reason and making a coherent system. It serves, critical theory as a philosophy, serves as a language game. And language, as we learn in logic, is ambiguous. Words are ambiguous, but the words are not just, we don't understand the meaning of them. They're philosophically ambiguous, meaning different words mean different things within different language games. So one thing may be said within one language game that makes no sense from another language game. So think about how we're using this term racism in the public sphere right now and why it makes everyone upset. Systemic racism is terminology within the critical theory language game, and it makes sense within that game. Why? Because systemic has to do with institutions, and institutional racism is how institutions have used values to privilege some groups that also oppresses, harms others. Now, I don't think systemic racism or institutional racism is hard to understand, but if you don't view it from within that system, it may not make sense to you. So talking about racism from a different language game may be about individuals. Like, I'm not a racist. I have black friends. Yeah, that's maybe not looking at the totality of systems and how they work and how oppression works. So this term racism or things like justice, social justice, equality, these are words that are interpreted in light of a system of belief. I like the language game because that makes sense. So these terms are used within a set of rules, a language, that outside that set of rules may not make sense. So you have to get into the game, see how it's played, how the parts work. So Monopoly, you know how all the parts work because you've read the rules. So you have to read the rules of critical theory, although critical theory, people who hold to it are not going to tell you this is a game. They think it's true. All right, so critical theory as a philosophy, remember we're talking about it as a philosophical system, gives meaning to all of life. And that's why it looks like a religion to some people, because if we say religion is a belief or set of beliefs used to give meaning to experience, and experience is all of life, critical theory, the philosophy, is doing that. So it does have something like religion to it, but I'm going to say it's more of a philosophy in terms of a belief system. So as a philosophy, like I mentioned, it has an epistemology, answering the question, how do we know? It has a metaphysics, answering the question, what is real? And part of that is, what is a human being? What are humans? It has an ethics and a view of what is good and evil. And it has a view of the common good. So it's not just an individual perspective. Critical theory is a collective perspective. And as such, it is going to offer the foundation for culture and civilization. And this is why people perceive it as tearing down everything. It's an alternative view of culture and civilization. And as such, it will have to displace the other older culture. And that's where deconstruction comes in. That's where critical comes in critical theory. That's where showing power dynamics comes in. So really we have the clash of philosophies right now in the public sphere. The problem is, we don't like to think philosophically. We don't like to think philosophically, and we don't want to do the hard work of thinking it through. So it's taken off like wildfire. Plus, the young people find it appealing. It's more attractive than, let's say, Christianity. All right, so critical theory has roots in Western civilization. It is Western, even though it's critiquing Western views. It is Western, but Western civilization itself is deeply divided, all the way back to the beginning with the Greeks and their materialism, the birth of Christianity as an alternative to that materialism. There's dualism in our history, so it's really important to study the history of philosophy to see where we are and what's happening now. So we are deeply divided along worldview lines or language game lines, if you want to put it in those terms. I don't know. Think of Judeo-Christian values as one language game, critical theory as another language game, and these two are opposite or opposed to one another in terms of their epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics, and view for the common good. That would include institutions of culture and law. What are the institutions? Family, religion, state, education, economics. So we have these institutions. All of them right now are in a crisis of authority. What's going to lead in these institutions? Who is going to lead in these institutions? We happen to have a political crisis happening as well that brings to light all of these fault lines. I'd like to wrap this up. So we're talking about what is critical theory. I'm suggesting it's a philosophical system. And I want to conclude this part by saying that as a philosophical system, it can be and should be critically analyzed and tested for meaning. Now, this becomes difficult because to question critical theory is to put yourself in a dangerous place. The crowd doesn't like that. To question is to be in a position of being the oppressor or a racist or whatever pejorative term they want to use to not have to come under critical scrutiny. So I think we can have this conversation publicly, but it is going to require common ground. So we need common ground for critical analysis of critical theory. And I'm going to talk about that next. What is common ground and how could we possibly make progress in a public discussion of these highly contentious issues? All right, I hope this was helpful looking at the philosophy of critical theory, seeing it as a philosophical system. I hope that's helpful to you. And if you have any questions, drop me a line. Otherwise, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.